And now we're going to move into the first presentation, research presentation of the morning with Dr. Magdalena Janus on Promise and Coming of Age, Lessons for the Future of the EDI. Magdalena is the co-developer of the Early Development Instrument along with Dan Offord. She holds a cherished dual role as professor at the Human Early Learning Partnership, SPPH at UBC, as well as at the Offord Center of Child Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. She too has been a longtime friend and colleague of Clyde and the rest of us at HELP. Over to you, Magdalena.
Well, I'm assuming that you can see my screen, and thank you very much for this introduction, Joanne. And I didn't quite realize what I was going to follow with my presentation, so I feel a little bit choked up and just have to thank you very much, everybody, for these wonderful introductions and stories. And also thank you for letting me share some thoughts with you today on this opening day of the HELP Expo 2021 series, where we also honor Clyde. I kind of imagine myself standing in the Robson Street UBC auditorium, as I have had privilege to do so several times. And I see you there in your seats or on the steps on the sides of the auditorium. And I hope you're listening and smiling and nodding and maybe even shaking your head when we say something outrageous. But most of all, thank you for being here. For me, the beginning of the journey that so far led us here to these ambitious goals for optimal child development in BC and everywhere started sometime in the late 1990s, where some of you may not even have been born yet then. But so what was the world like in late 1990s? Well, it already started its alarming warming up trend. About 20% of Canadians lived in poverty. But the yearly trend started a promising downward slide, and we will have a chance to see it further, going further in Martin's presentation. For children, the percentages were slightly higher than for the whole population. And in BC, they were higher than the Canadian averages, and they remained so. Clyde Hertzman, Dan Offord, and Fraser Mustard had already had very distinguished careers and achievements behind them in the late 90s. Yet luckily for us, they did not stop. All three of them, apart from being such amazing professionals, they were also foremost and first advocates for children's well-being, and for children's mental health. Dan and Clyde were also involved in the design of the National Longitudinal Study of Children and Youth, which was a Canadian sample-based comprehensive provincially representative study. The NLSCY ended up becoming an incredibly valuable source of detailed data on child development and on growing up in Canada. The sample was representative of children at the provincial, national and provincial level. However, it was pretty clear that the sample-based study will never be possible to be disaggregated to represent communities and smaller groups of people in our country. To a certain extent, it assumed that the same processes may be in place across various geographies. Finally, the speech from the throne that was delivered in 1997 confirmed the federal government's commitment to measure and report on the readiness to learn of Canadian children so that we can assess our progress in providing our children with the best possible start. And here's a small digression, a jump outside of Canada. Globally, in the late 1990s, the world was formulating ambitious Millennium Development Goals, 8 of them. However, only one was focused on children, and at that was only focused on children's survival, nothing to do with development or thriving. So research coming from the NLSCY combined with intimate knowledge of children, youth, and local communities, such as the one that Clyde possessed so clearly, as we've heard and we will hear and we know, made it pretty clear to all three of these giants that there could be no progress without progress for all. So interesting and useful as they were, sample-based studies were just not sufficient to move the needle, or in other words, to move politicians to action or voters to hold them accountable for that action or for the lack of action, actually. So what was really needed, what was a result of this collaboration, was a need to monitor child development for all children. And I was really extremely fortunate to be drawn into this powerful intellectual conversation in 1997. This result of this was a method to check at the earliest possible stage that is feasible to measure on a wide scale how children are doing. And not just those who may be at a particular risk, that was well established, not just in one aspect and not just in one place. So the promises of this endeavor were that we would finally know what is the status of early child development in BC, in Canada. We will be able to monitor because that way we will know that things, loosely understood, work or do not work for children, and that we will be able to understand the mechanisms behind the community resilience, and then through examining community and neighborhood differences in relation to socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. Before we go to fulfilling this promise, we had to sort out the terminology. School readiness was the concept we started with, but it was found to be very narrow, and it ended up to be largely abandoned, certainly by us, because it used to focus only on academics. So Clyde and Dan Keating coined a beautiful term of developmental health, which encompasses a wide range of developmental outcomes, physical, mental, behavioral, and academic, and it is a reflection of the early childhood experiences at home and in the community. As our presentations today focus on the EDI, I will just remind you what it is. It is a population-level measure of child development in 5 developmental domains. It's completed by kindergarten teacher for each child in the classroom. The name was coined by Clyde Hertzman. Who else? The innovation of the EDI that covers those 5 developmental domains was precisely that and as an instrument reflecting children's developmental health at school entry, it didn't focus just on academic domains, but also physical and socio-emotional. And the second main innovation was its implementation, that it was completed for all children in classrooms, in schools, thus making the results similar to census. We talk a lot about vulnerability, and vulnerability on the EDI has a specific definition. First, we look at each domain, and we identify children who have scores below the lowest 10th percentile threshold in comparison to the baseline distribution, and a child who is vulnerable on one or more domains is deemed vulnerable. So let us now examine some of the aspects of those promises that the EDI's creation was burdened with. Do we know the status of early child development in Canada? Well, we know quite a bit about it since we collected data for over 1 million children. And nationally, 27% of children are vulnerable, with a 14% gap between boys and girls. And try to remember that there is a difference between boys and girls. We can also track and compare the vulnerabilities in provinces over time. Paul will speak more to those results, and thank you, Paul, for letting me show your slide. But as you can see just briefly here is that on average per province, it's between 25% and 35% of children who are vulnerable at school entry. In his early presentations, anticipating the usefulness of future EDI data, Clyde used to show this graph with fictitious data. So he, as an indicator of neighborhood disadvantage, he chose the percent of lone parent families in neighborhood. And the graph shows a plot of vulnerability against that. I asked Barry whether we could reconstruct this old hypothetical graph with new BC data, and Barry constructed one for me. Thank you very much, Barry. And this is the result. As you will see, Clyde was pretty close in his prediction. Sadly, unlike in the first graph, we don't have any neighborhoods with 0 lone parents. but the association is still there, though milder, and the outlier neighborhoods are less dramatically outlying than the science fiction that Clyde had shown. However, it is this graph that Barry also constructed that illustrates better the somewhat sobering reflection on our promises. This is a relation between the EDI vulnerability and the SES index in wave 7. It is quite clear that not only there are fewer areas which are doing better than predicted than those who are doing worse than predicted, but those who do so at the low SES level are very few, and they have really high vulnerability. So the only reason they sort of off diagonal, because they're not doing as horribly bad as based on the prediction from that line. To me, that is a very humbling discovery, which contributes to our lack of understanding so far, those mechanisms behind the so-called community resiliency, and puts somewhat in question whether it even exists. So have we fulfilled our promises? Well, we do know that between 25% and 40% of children in Canada are still vulnerable in their developmental health at school entry. We know that the rate is growing in BC. We do know that monitoring is essential, but it really does not solve the problems. And we still do not understand why some communities do better than others, even if they do. So coming of age, as I put in my title, is supposed to mean that we gained wisdom. Well, I think maybe we have, maybe sometimes even more so wisdom, awareness, and courage to speak in 2021 than maybe even a few years ago. So here are a few possible suggestions why maybe BC vulnerabilities are not going down. And one suggestion I wanted to offer is perhaps we still do not know enough about why they are there in the first place. And as a first example, I would like to offer you an idea of coverage. And this is a fairly old graph, but illustrates it very well. That comes from the work of our friend and colleague Marnie Browner in Manitoba. If you look at this, in the lowest SES group, 83% of children pass the writing the test and in grade 3. So that's a pretty high percentage, right? But if you actually, but that graph looks only at children who took the test. If you actually take all children who should have taken the test, in that lowest SES group, you only have 50% who pass. So what really that makes us think is, when we think that we see the whole population, do we really have access to the whole population? And that's one key thing. The second thing that I really wanted to draw your attention to, some demographics aspects. So here with specifically sex and race ethnicity. I talk about sex rather than gender because we only have the biological sex of a child, not gender identity on the EDI. We do know about the sex-based differences in the EDI, but we somehow ignore them a little bit. So these graphs show the differences in relationship between probability of vulnerability and neighborhood disadvantage, neighborhood status for boys and girls in 5 EDI domains. For boys, the likelihood of achieving the developmental expectations by kindergarten is more prone to influence of neighborhood advantage than it is for girls. So we know that from our own research, and yet the possibility of differential use of these data is somehow not a part of many conversations. You can see here that the lines representing the associations for boys and girls, they don't converge. They start in different places and they end in different places. Even worse, and we have to rely on data from other countries, such as United States in this case. We know that race ethnicity makes a big difference in child development. So this graph is Black children, and they're doing worse than white children, but pretty much worse than any other ethnicity. And even worse, and albeit still in the USA, inequality of children's developmental health is such that Black children living in the highest socioeconomic quintile still have vulnerability comparable to white children living in the second lowest socioeconomic quintile. I will not comment further on this, and except for saying that we really have no idea how these relationships and those gradients look like in Canada. So the second final possibility I wanted to put out to you in terms of the how informative our data are, is that we really still do not know true impact of early intervention and prevention programs at the community level, of which there are quite a lot. And I chose here, such as parenting support program, which I chose as an example. I chose parenting here as parenting is not an easy job. And I think many of you in the audience can relate to this sentiment, especially now in the context of the pandemic. But I also just wanted to share this beautiful photo. So based on a review that our colleague Joanne and a few of us had done just over a year ago, we know that there are plenty of parenting support programs for parents of young children. They are large programs that have been evaluated, and in BC, evaluation of the nurse-family partnership is ongoing. Families First Home Visiting in Manitoba that has been evaluated. Triple P, positive parenting program that has been quite popular, but has been only evaluated in pockets. But there's also a lot of community-based programs from religious organizations across Canada that we really have no idea whether they make any difference, because the evaluation just doesn't happen. Well, hopefully that may change. A colleague and a friend of mine, Rebecca Gokiert from University of Alberta, is leading an evaluation capacity network, which is specifically focused on strengthening evaluation capacity in the field of early childhood development. So maybe this knowledge will change in the future as well, and we'll be able to explain the thriving and vulnerability a little bit better. Let us come back to the beautiful British Columbia for a few more thoughts. What if the vulnerabilities are not improving proportionally, no matter what we are doing? So this is that graph that you will be seeing today several times still, the percentage of vulnerable children in BC over time. But I would like you to consider another statistics. And once again, thank you, Barry, for providing this to me. And that's the breadth of vulnerabilities per neighborhood in any given cycle. So the purple line shows the highest as per neighborhood. So that's the highest. So they're in wave 1, wave 2, there were some neighborhoods that had over 50%, and in wave 7, almost 70% of children vulnerable. But on the positive side, there were some that had 6 and 12 in wave 7. So basically, we have communities at any level of vulnerability in that yellow corridor. And even worse, when you look at schools, we have schools in BC, in Ontario, and pretty much any other province that we collect EDI data, that you have 0 children vulnerable and you have 100% of children vulnerable. And to be honest with you, I feel that the priority should be to decrease this range. It would be very nice to decrease the average itself, but that's something that makes me anxious when I wake up in the morning. Why is that still happening? So let me cruise to the finish line here with some thoughts on lessons learned and legacy. I do believe that the main lesson learned is that we cannot stop now. And I kind of thought that I heard that in the talks that preceded mine, because we really have not achieved what we set out to do. We need to push for more equitable and inclusive data collections and for more equality in outcomes. But we also have legacy that we can be proud of, and some of it has already been mentioned and will be. I am sure, as you know, it is 2021 now, and the global agenda has moved on too. So I'd like to spend the last couple of minutes on that. In 2015, the year that Millennium Development Goals were supposed to be reached, which they really largely weren't, Sustainable Development Goals with the 2030 agenda were approved. And that produced 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and SDG 4 specifically is focused on children and is much more comprehensive, and shall I maybe even say more in a more modern way than the MDGs were. So the Sustainable Development Goal 4 is focused on ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning, but it also focuses and mentions specifically in targets and indicators early child development. So when we started this EDI journey in the late 1990s, I think people did not believe it was possible to measure early child development on a population level, let alone globally. And yet many new measures with ambition for population level collection of data are emerging. The global scales for early development, or GSED, for children under 3, and for children 4 to 6, the national outcome measure in the United States, the new set of 20 universal caregiver report published by World Bank, and of course the UNICEF ECDI 2030, which is the agreed measure for the indicator 4.2 on the SDG 4. So the EDI data per se, because of the way they are collected, are not contributing to the official SDG monitoring database. But it is enough, though, to look at the items chosen for the US measure, the World Bank, the ECDI, and the GSED, that the work that we have done collecting, analyzing, and reporting on the EDI data, the work that Clyde had done promoting this approach at many, many national and international platforms, ever since the EDI has taken off, has made it possible for these new measures to emerge and be considered for population level collections. We sort of said, yes, we can have population level data on child development when nobody believed that. So I think we need to repeat it now by acting on, yes, we can flatten the growing curve of children's vulnerability, or shall I say, plank it. I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I want to send my heartfelt thanks to Clyde, Dan, and Fraser, and my team and colleagues at the Offord Center and at HELP, without whom none of this would have ever been possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Magdalena. I think I'm going to turn it over to Sally now to pass on any questions that have emerged as you've been speaking.
Yes, thank you. We've got a couple just coming through now. Thank you, Magdalena, for sharing your wisdom with us today. So we have a couple coming through. So the question is HELP thinking about starting to look at disaggregated data to understand how race or being racialized affects child development outcomes, since we aren't doing that in Canada yet?
Well, I think we're in the very early stages of that thinking. I actually have to say that we haven't quite discussed this at the national level. I know that there are some fledgling efforts in Ontario, and I don't know, Martin or Paul, would you like to speak to that from the BC perspective? Or should we just leave it maybe for later?
We can come back to it.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial, but it has to be done. You know, you guys in BC have done something that most other provinces, and Manitoba did that too. Other provinces are so way behind in the way that the Indigenous data are collected and respected in BC. And whatever happens with the data on race and interpretation has to be done in a very similar way with those communities and with colleagues. And it has to be done in a respectful way. It's absolutely crucial that it happens, but it has to be done properly.
Thanks, Magdalena. And you wrote a great op-ed about that earlier last year that maybe we'll tweet out again so everyone can take a look at that. The next one, we've got one more so far. And I haven't read these through yet, they're coming in a bit fast. So how is childcare seen in policy and practice as a parenting support program? As we move slowly towards universal access to childcare programs in BC and across Canada, how can we include or strengthen childcare as a broadly parent supporting program beyond supporting access to work and school?
What a marvelous question. I'm a visual person, so I may forget what some of that, and I can't see it. But I think, you know, the quality is obvious. You know, like, it's I remember many years ago, like must have been late 1990s. I was at I live in Southern Ontario, and a local MP referred to childcare as babysitting, and you should have seen the room. Like, everybody just kind of lost it. But that's kind of what we need to make sure, that the quality is there. It's really not just a way to leave children so that people can get economic benefits of working. but sometimes that's the language that gets across the quality and the developmental advantages that come from stimulating early learning and the dedication of the early educators and their education, their knowledge, their commitment is very often very difficult to monetize and talk in terms of the advantages. So sometimes I believe maybe that's what you're referring to, that language is maybe lost, but I may have missed the question, but I think it's a very important point. Thank you.
Thanks, Magdalena. And Martina is also diving into some of these questions as well. So we've got another question here from a health affiliate, Dr. Mariana Brusoni, who asks, while governments struggle with COVID and the wide range of effects, how can we ensure early childhood development is front and center and use the EDI data and other data sources to support this case?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer. I think we're doing our best in providing, but a very small answer, because I can see that the 5 minutes are kind of coming to the end, is that, unlike many other data that we're collecting right now, and I know in many research organizations, many of my colleagues, myself, are asking teachers, asking parents how COVID impacted children. With the EDI, we have the counterfactual, we kind of have the trends, we have the information, what was the relationship between socioeconomic disadvantage or advantage, between the quality of environments and early child development outcomes. So, with data collections, when it restarts to a certain extent, it already restarted in DC, but not necessarily in many other provinces, we will be able to potentially quantify the impact of the pandemic on child development. So that is certainly something that we will have to do in years to come, actually very, very quickly, in order to quantify the impact of pandemic on early child development.